Welcome to the Essential Southern Podcast, where we explore the rich history, culture, and traditions of the American South.
Welcome to the Essential Southern Podcast. I'm your host, Brian McClanahan, and this podcast is sponsored by the Abbeville Institute. The Abbeville Institute is dedicated to exploring what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition. So if you like this podcast, our videos, our programs, our website, all the things that we do, our books, head over to abbevilleinstitute.org. That's ABBEVILLE institute.org. Make a tax-deductible donation to the full extent of the law and help us continue to explore what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition. All right, we're going to talk about today a book written in the early 20th century by a man named Hilary Abner Herbert. He's from Alabama. And the book is entitled The Arlington Confederate Monument. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about the Arlington Monument. Of course, it was taken down not long ago, illegally by the Naming Commission. And of course, there is some fight going on to put it back up. But this particular book was written following the dedication of the monument, and it includes a history of the monument, history of the process by which it was put there, and of course, the dedication ceremony, along with the description of the monument itself. It has pictures. It's a really wonderful book if you want to get an idea for what was done in Arlington at the early part of the 20th century. Now, Hilary Herbert's an interesting fellow. He had served as the Secretary of the Navy in the Grover Cleveland administration. He was a Confederate veteran, and he was put in charge of the Arlington Monument Memorial Association. So he wrote this book after his time serving in that role. And I'm going to show you an image of Hilary Herbert. He died in 1919, and his coffin, he was lying in state in Montgomery, Alabama. And so I'm going to show this to you. You're going to see it if you're watching on YouTube. I'm going to show a big image of it. And I'm going to talk over that image, and then, of course, you'll see me again on the other side of that. So here's the image. And, of course, this is, in many ways, a perfect symbol of reconciliation. Hilary Herbert, the Confederate veteran, is lying in state. You see several Confederate flags in the picture, but you also see several U.S. flags in the picture. And next to him are two probably Alabama National Guardsmen. World War I had just ended, not long before this. And so he has two soldiers guarding his coffin. Again, the symbol of reconciliation, as was the Arlington Confederate Monument. And in fact, people talked about that during the dedication ceremonies. So, we've looked at the picture. We're back. And this notion of reconciliation was very important to Americans 50 years on from the war. They understood that the wounds of the war had been healed not only by World War I, which of course all Americans went out and fought that war, but also by the Spanish-American War. And Herbert had actually talked about that quite a bit, so had others. That was really the beginning of the healing process. This war by which both Northerners and Southerners were going to go defeat the Spanish in a common cause. And what I want to do today is read a speech from this Arlington Confederate Monument or Arlington Reconciliation Memorial, whatever you want to call it. It is a reconciliation memorial, and I know there's a lot of emphasis put on that now. Herbert called it the Confederate Monument. But I want to read two speeches. The first is from the commander of the Grand Army of the Republic. Now, if you don't know what that is, that was the Union version of the Confederate Veterans. It was the largest political action committee and lobbyist group in the United States. In fact, it had done a lot to ensure that Republicans were elected to the presidency several times. John Logan, who was one of the individuals who conceptualized the Grand Army of the Republic, had basically said that this was going to be a slush fund for the Republican Party. They were going to raise money for Republicans. They were going to ensure Republicans were elected. And here at this event, June of 1914, when the monument is unveiled, it's a warm day. It's actually fitting at the end of the memorial. There was supposed to be a 21-gun salute, and it was rained out. Kind of an omen for what was eventually going to happen 110 years later. In that, there was supposed to be this grand celebration, and it was. I mean, look, was a grand celebration. The President of the United States, who I'm also going to include in this podcast, made a speech as well. And I'm going to do that speech in a little different way. I hope you enjoy how I put that together. So I'll talk about that after I read the speech by the commander of the Grand Army of the Republic. But June 3rd, I think it was June 3rd, 1914 is when the event took place. Warm day, 10,000 people showed up. 10,000 people showed up for this event. Young, old, all there to see the unveiling of this beautiful monument, which, as Herbert says in his book on the monument, it was the largest bronze statue, bronze relief in the United States, rivaled only by the statue to Frederick the Great in Germany. That was it. It was a beautiful work of art. And I say was because now it's been removed. Now there is some discussion about putting it somewhere else in the state of Virginia, but it has been removed. And in fact, when you read these speeches and you hear these speeches, which you're going to hear one, and it's going to be fun the way I did this. When you read these speeches and hear these speeches, you see that this was a monument to the dead of the Confederacy. It was essentially a tombstone. Now, Moses Ezekiel was not dead yet, of course, when they dedicated it, but when he did die, they stuck his grave right at the base of the monument. This was designed to be a memorial to the dead in a cemetery. And if you look at the charge of the Naming Commission, no monuments in cemeteries were supposed to be disturbed by the Naming Commission. Last time I checked, Arlington National Cemetery is a cemetery, and it is a monument to the dead in the cemetery, not unlike any other monument in the cemetery itself. In fact, as the program shows, which is included in this book, after this event was over, there was a dedication to the Union dead in the cemetery as well. It's remarkable that these villains got away with this, and I mean that literally. These people were villains. These people are thieves. They have stolen a part of American history and heritage out of that cemetery. And they did it cloaked with the moral righteousness of the modern age. Now, these people in 1914 thought that this monument would exist for generations and it would be the shining example of reunification. It would be the shining example of reconciliation and humanity. That the men who had been shot at attended this cemetery and this dedication ceremony in honor of Confederate dead showed you that the ill will and hard feelings had disappeared by 1914. Where are we now? What have we done by tearing this down? Well, you've just rekindled that ill will and hard feelings. Now, I know that the proponents of this say, no, we corrected American history. I guess all of these people were stupid. I guess all of these people were wrong. 10,000 of them that showed up to talk about reconciliation and how grand this monument was and how glorious this was for the United States as a whole, that they could have this thing there. Now, the critique of the monument, of course, is the part of the monument that includes Black Americans on it. And as I mentioned in the essay I wrote for the group, the Defend Arlington group, the history presented in that part of the monument was no different than someone like Booker T. Washington had said in his book Up From Slavery, which was written not long before the monument was dedicated. Washington talks about slavery in the South during the war and how, of course, all of these people wanted to be free. There's no doubt about that. They didn't want to be slaves. They didn't want to be tied into that system. They wanted to have their freedom. They wanted to exercise their freedom, and they were happy when freedom came. No one would dispute that. But they also had fraternal feelings and familiar feelings with many of the white Southerners who oftentimes were in power positions over these people themselves. In fact, Washington talks about that. They would have defended the family where they lived with their lives had someone tried to hurt them during the war. And that's the history that was stuck into the monument. Now, that's not politically correct today. It's not something that people really talk about. They don't believe it, but Booker T. Washington said it. I mean, if he didn't say it, well, then I would think that this is a myth. But when people have said it, now it didn't mean all black Americans thought this. No, don't get me wrong. But there were certainly many that did. So this monument is a reflection of the time in which it is created. It is a reflection of the history that was understood at the time it was created. And it should never have been taken down. It's barbaric to do that. But that's why I want to focus on this speech by the General of the Grand Army of the Republic. And then, after I finish that, I'll talk about the next speech. So, let me get into this. This very much a reconciliationist speech. There's no other way to describe it. Now, I could have read the speech by Hillary Herbert. He made a speech at the dedication ceremony. I could have read the speech by the commander of the Confederate veterans. But I want to focus on this speech because it shows you the nature of reconciliation. It's not long. Not a long speech at all. But he does explain why this monument is there. This is General Washington Gardner. Now, Washington Gardner had actually been wounded during the war. This is not some guy that was just an armchair soldier that was, some kind of quartermaster officer. This man had been wounded during the war. And I want you to pay attention to how he describes the monument. Okay? He says, "It seems fitting that here in this place and on these grounds, once the home of Robert E. Lee, there should rest the remains of some of the gallant men who followed that great soldier even unto death." He just called Confederate soldiers gallant soldiers. This is the commander of the Grand Army of the Republic. Not a Confederate veteran, but on the other side. A man who was wounded during the war by Confederate bullets. He calls his enemies in the war gallant soldiers. It is fitting here, in sight of the nation's capital, and this vast burial plot consecrated to American valor, that some of our fellow countrymen, the representatives of once hostile armies, whose unsurpassed bravery is now a common heritage and pride, should rest in undisturbed slumber, and that the place of final sepulture should be under the supervision and care of the national government. These are Confederate soldiers who had unsurpassed bravery and a common heritage and pride. Listen to Ty Seidgerly when he describes Confederate soldiers. Traitors! Brooks Simpson, traitors! Ty Seidgerly, the general professor, supposedly knows more about who these people are than the men who actually fought them. Now, it doesn't mean there weren't people saying these things during the war and immediately after the war. Of course there were. But here we are in 1914, 50 years later, and this is how they're recognizing these things. They're not calling these people traitors. They're not calling these people enemies. They're calling them gallant soldiers with a common heritage and pride. They're proud of those Confederate soldiers. And they should rest undisturbed in their slumber. Well, I think cranes and machines were going to disturb their slumber. And it's under the supervision and care of the national government. Care would not be ripping it down. I think every one of the 10,000 people attending, including the Union veterans, would be shocked by the dopes that wear the Army uniform today like Ty Seidgerle. In fact, I think they would disown them. Ty Seidgerle should be ashamed to do this. When you read this from a Union veteran who's at the dedication ceremony. This is not coming from a Confederate veteran. This is coming from someone from the North. The presence of the chief magistrate of the nation, members of his cabinet, and others of others high in the councils of the government, with that of representatives from every section of the country, participating in these dedicatory exercises, serve to illustrate anew that the sectional bitterness and hate long preceding, and which culminated in the Great War, no longer find a place in the hearts nor expression upon the lips of our countrymen, unless you're Ty Seidgerle and the dopes in the naming commission. Again, let me read this. The presence of the chief magistrate, Woodrow Wilson, was there. President of the United States. Members of his cabinet were there. And of others high in the councils of the government, with that of representatives from every section of the country. There are members of Congress there. Participating in these dedicatory exercises serve to illustrate anew that the sectional bitterness and hate, which is all you can say about Ty Seidgerle and his dopey naming commission, long proceeding, in which culminated in the Great War, no longer find a place in the hearts nor expression upon the lips of our countrymen. The members of the United States military on that naming commission should all be ashamed of themselves. They should be leading the charge to put it back up. Because what they have done is spit in the face of these Union veterans. Not Confederate veterans, Union veterans. Monuments of whatever enduring material are the visible expression of appreciation, of gratitude, or of affection. A monumentless people is either a people without a history or else a people without a heart. Whoa. Rip them down. We're either a people without a history or a people without a heart. I would say that these Orwellian dopes on the naming commission are both. They don't want to have any history that contradicts their righteous cause myth. They don't want to have anything out there that might spark some discussion about the other side of the war. They don't want that at all. This monument was not created for Jim Crow or any of those stupid things that these people say. It was created in honor of the dead in the cemetery in which it was placed. Because people had a heart, unless you're Taliban Thai. This memorial structure speaks the language of peace and goodwill. Yeah. Again, this is Washington Gardner, commander of the Grand Army of the Republic, not the Confederate veteran, not the UDC. It's the man who commanded the largest Republican PAC, Political Action Committee, before they called them that, in the United States. And it was noted in the speeches, and even Woodrow Wilson says, notice who put this thing here. Republicans. William McKinley first came up with the idea for something. William Howard Taft then agreed to it. McKinley, of course, who was an officer in the Union Army. And then Taft. But that's who put it there. It says, to all who come hither and read the superscription, that the swords and bayonets that once gleamed along the battle's fiery front have been beaten into plowshares and pruning hooks. Which, of course, it's exactly what it said. But the funniest thing is that you've got all these woke idiots running around melting down statues saying, we're beating statues into plowshares. This is what the monument literally was about. It says it on the monument, or did, until they took it down. So we're beating swords into plowshares by taking down a monument that says this is there for swords into plowshares. That makes sense. Now, of course, they haven't melted this one down, but I bet you they'd want to. It declares through the symbolical wreath of unfading laurel held in outstretched hand above the sleeping dead that the spirit of heroic devotion and lofty self-sacrifice which they manifested is held in grateful and affectionate memory. So it's a monument to dead in a cemetery, which was outside the purview of the naming commission, and yet we have a bunch of morons on the federal bench and in Congress who voted for this. And a naming commission made up of people in the United States military that are, again, spitting in the face of real Union veterans. There is room in the hearts of the people of all the land for cherished recollections of the various dead, and at the same time for the most unfaltering love and loyalty and devotion to the Union of all the states. So we have this room in our hearts for the cherished recollections of the various dead, and for loyalty and devotion to the Union of the United of all the states. Without the existence of the former, we should be disposed to doubt the sincerity or steadfastness of the latter. So if we can't trust this devotion if we didn't have room in our hearts for the dead of all the land. In the perspective of the receding years, the war looms in increasing proportions along the national horizon. Its great and beneficent results, now everywhere recognized, are gradually settling into the abiding convictions of all intelligent men. So he's saying, look, the war's over. Everybody recognizes it was a good thing. In 1914, we ended slavery, we saved the Union, we did all these things. And North and South, this is a good... And Hillary Herbert actually said this stuff. That's why I showed you the picture of his coffin when he's lying in state, because it's a perfect symbol of reconciliation. For a full 80 years, the system of government founded by our fathers was regarded by many as an experiment. Doubting patriots at home and unfriendly critics abroad foretold the coming certain dissolution of the Union. With much show of reason, they declared our government rested upon an insecure foundation. The recognized fundamental weakness was a constant menace to the permanency of the superstructure. Prior to the war, the existence of this weakness had, with portentous threatenings, repeatedly manifested itself both in the North and the South. In the light of the past, the war for the preservation of the Union and for the settlement by the armament of arms of the great constitutional question involved seemed inevitable. In the stupendous conflict, neither side will ever have to apologize for the sincerity or the devotion of its adherents. Well, I guess you could say that in 1914, but now, I don't know. I mean, that's what Gardner is saying, but I guess not now. So this was a war for the Union. We had all these conflicts going on, and of course, this was eventually going to be settled by arms. But no one had to apologize for either side. Again, a member, the commanding officer of the Grand Army of the Republic. When the battle clouds lifted and the light of peace shone in, when the people had again become settled in their wonted avocations and dispassionately surveyed the results, it was found that the menace which had so long disturbed the tranquility of the people and threatened the existence of the Union had been forever removed. But I thought no one in the South talked about, I mean, of course, this is a Union guy, but they all talked about slavery. He's saying it here. He's saying the menace was removed. Slavery was gone, right? So when people say the Lost Cause didn't talk about slavery, yes, they did. Yes, they did. And they understood that it was part of the conflict. Was it the thing? I mean, some would say it is. Even on the southern side, they would say it was. But regardless, they talked about it. So this idea, the people that say the lost cause didn't talk about this, of course they did. These are people that don't know anything about what they're talking about. They talked about it. It was found that the fundamental issues involved have been irrevocably settled, and that the foundation stones upon which the Republic rested had been cemented anew by the shed blood of our countrymen from the North and from the South. So we had these questions of state power, federalism. Of course, within that, you had all the issues that went with that, which could have been tariffs, internal improvements, banking, slavery, anything that was thrown into that. The key was understanding the powers of the center and what it could and could not do, and then all these other issues worked into that. And of course, slavery, the slavery in the Western territories agitated it more than anything else. Because what kind of power did the general government have over that institution in the Western territories? Not in the states, but in the Western territories. That was the issue. And you can go back to the 18th century and people are talking about these things. Okay, so all of this was wrapped into that notion of what kind of power the general government would have. And Gardner is saying this has all now been settled. Now we are indeed an indestructible union of indestructible states. We are in very truth a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, resting on an enduring foundation. Now, what's really remarkable is that Hillary Herbert talked about Lincoln, Southerners admiring Lincoln in 1914. He was the guy that they all recognized would have saved them. They used to hate Lincoln, but now they understand Lincoln. They revere Lincoln. Lincoln is important to them. He is the glue to them that would hold everything together. As the fast vanishing lines of the surviving Federal and Confederate soldiers marching side by side in peace and amity enter the twilight in the fading afterglow of life's long day, soon to be forever lost to mortal sight, of one thing we may rest assured, and that is that whenever and wherever in future the battle line is drawn, there will be found the sons of these heroic fathers and of their scarcely less heroic mothers, standing side by side, shoulder to shoulder, in defense of the Union and for the perpetuity of the government founded by our fathers. So as we have these lines of Union and Confederate soldiers marching side by side, we know their sons are going to march side by side in honor. And we know their sons will do this. He's thinking about in the future what's going to happen. We're going to look on this monument, we're going to look on this reconciliation period, and we're going to admire it because we were able to bury the sword. We were able to pound the sword into a plowshare, and we were able to move on. The contemplation of a glorious past stirs the blood in an hour like this, while the thought of a limitless future with all its possibilities and its hopes and fears beckons our countrymen to the discharge of every duty and fidelity to every trust in peace, even as the fathers were vigilant and faithful in war. That's his speech. That's a reconciliationist speech. That's not calling the other side traitors. That's not saying this monument is a lost cause fiction. None of that. Here's a man who fought in the war, looking at the monument and saying, this is a great thing. It's a great thing. And we should admire it. Now, I'm going to close this particular episode of the Essential Southern podcast with something that's different. Woodrow Wilson also made a speech at this event. What I did is went out and I found audio recordings of Woodrow Wilson. And I was able to download those audio recordings and run it through a computer to regenerate his voice. I took the text of the speech, ran it through the regeneration, and it's like Woodrow Wilson is making the speech. You're going to hear it. Now, you can tell there's limits to AI. There's limits to what computers can do. It doesn't sound perfect, but it does sound almost exactly like Woodrow Wilson, with the exception of there are some little parts you can tell that the computer was trying to wrestle with this. It also has a very grainy tone to it because of the audio that I could find was from grainy phonographs. And I don't have Peter Jackson's, or these modern audio studios' ability to separate it out and clean it all up. I don't have that technology. So what I've given you is Woodrow Wilson's voice over a Woodrow Wilson speech. I added in, as you're going to see, some pictures and some things that would make this maybe have a little more feeling to it. Some still images from the event itself. Both of Woodrow Wilson making the speech, the crowd in attendance, some of the children that were there. At the end of the speech, if you read the program, the band played My Country, 'Tis of Thee and the Star-Spangled Banner. Now, this was before the Star-Spangled Banner by Francis Scott Key was called the national anthem. That did not happen until the Franklin Roosevelt administration. But isn't it odd, if this was just about the Confederacy, that the concluding tunes weren't Dixie, but the Star-Spangled Banner and My Country, 'Tis of Thee? What I gave you are audio recordings of those from the 19th century to give you kind of a feel for what this might have sounded like in the voice, and also it has that grainy kind of feel to it. I also added in a couple of clap tracks because it kind of bridged the things and put them together. Those are modern, and it doesn't sound exactly like it would have been from the time. I couldn't do that. But I hope that this will give you a feel. We can hear Woodrow Wilson in many ways making his own speech, even though it's Wilson's voice for the most part. I mean, again, you can tell there's limitations with it. It's AI. But it's his speech, and it's his voice. And it's 19th century recordings of those two tunes, which again shows you the monument was about reconciliation. It was about healing the wounds of the war, and everybody was rallying around the U.S. flag. In fact, you see at this dedication ceremony a whole bunch of U.S. flags in attendance. You also see some Confederate flags around the monument. This is true. That's because they were all together. I mean, this was the idea. You're all together, just like Herbert's grave, just like this dedication ceremony. I think this is rather interesting and neat, and hopefully you'll enjoy it. So I'm gonna conclude my part of this. We're gonna wrap up with this Wilson speech. Until next time, good day.
I assure you that I am profoundly aware of the solemn significance of the thing that has now taken place. The Daughters of the Confederacy have presented a memorial of their dead to the government of the United States. I hope that you have noted the history of the conception of this idea. It was suggested by a President of the United States who had himself been a distinguished officer in the Union Army. It was authorized by an act of Congress of the United States. The cornerstone of the monument was laid during the term of a President of the United States, elevated to his high position by the votes of the party, which had chiefly prided itself upon sustaining the war for the Union, and who, while Secretary of War, had given authority to erect it. And now it has fallen to my lot to accept in the name of the great government, which I am privileged for the time to represent, the emblem of a reunited people. I am not so much happy as proud to participate in this capacity on such an occasion. Proud that I should represent such a people. Am I mistaken, ladies and gentlemen, in supposing that nothing of this sort could have occurred in anything but a democracy? The people of a democracy are not related to their rulers as subjects are related to a government. They are themselves the sovereign authority, and as they are neighbors of each other, quickened by the same passions and moved by the same motives, they can understand each other. They are shot through with some of the deepest and profoundest instincts of human sympathy. They choose their governments, they consult their rulers, they live their own life, and they will not have that life disturbed and discolored by fraternal misunderstandings. I know that a reuniting of spirits like this can take place more quickly in our time than in any other, because men are now united by an easier transmission of those influences which make up the foundations of peace and of mutual understanding. But no process can work these effects unless it is a conducting medium. The conducting medium in this instance is the united heart of a great people. I am not going to detain you by trying to repeat any of the eloquent thoughts which have moved us this afternoon, for I rejoice in the simplicity of the task which is assigned to me. That task is this, ladies and gentlemen. This chapter in the history of the United States is now closed, And I can bid you turn with me your faces to the future, quickened by the memories of the past, but with nothing to do with the contest for the past. Knowing as we have shed our blood upon opposite sides, we now face and admire one another. I do not know how many years ago it was that the Century Dictionary was published, but I remember one day in the Century Encyclopedia of Names, I had occasion to turn to the name of Robert E. Lee, and I found him there in that book published in New York City, simply described as a great American general. The generosity of our judgment did not begin today. The generosity of our judgment was made up soon after this great struggle was over, when men came and sat together again in the Congress and united in all the efforts of peace and of government. And our solemn duty is to see that each one of us is in his own consciousness and in his own conduct replica of this great reunited people. It is our duty and our privilege to be like the country we represent, speaking no word of malice, no word of criticism in the earth, standing shoulder to lift the burdens of mankind in the future and show the paths of freedom to all the world.
I'm